The belief that they were fleeing the confines of war was a comforting illusion. The reality, which they had yet to grasp, was that they were stumbling directly into the heart of a land defined by a different kind of law, the unwritten, timeless code of the American cowboy. In the profound, star-flecked darkness that precedes dawn, Corporal Ernst Keller pressed his cheek against the frigid, gritty soil, feeling the earth's chill seep into his bones. The barbed wire above him emitted a sinister, metallic hiss as it scraped against the coarse fabric of his uniform, a sound that seemed deafening in the immense silence. His every exhale materialized as a ghostly plume in the biting Texas air. Crouched beside him, Private Otto Fuchs trembled, his knuckles white as he clutched a small, stolen tin of water, their most precious commodity. A lone, mournful howl from a coyote pierced the stillness, and Keller became a statue, every muscle taut. The prisoner of war camp, known as Camp Hearn, lay in a deep slumber behind them, its silence broken only by the low, monotonous drone of a generator near the watchtower. A single guard patrolled with a languid, almost bored gait, his rifle resting casually on his shoulder. His shadow, cast by the pale tower light, stretched out like a long, thin finger across the dusty compound. For 7 nights, Keller had observed this man, counting his steps with the precision of a strategist studying a battlefield. 12 paces north, a pause, then 12 paces south. It was a rhythm as predictable as a metronome. Now, Keller breathed, the word barely audible. Together, they slid on their bellies beneath the lowest strand of wire. Their worn boots sank into the dew-laden grass, and every faint creak from the straining fence felt to them like a thunderclap announcing their betrayal. But no alarm sounded. No searchlight split the darkness. No shouted command echoed across the grounds. Slowly, hesitantly, they rose to their feet, their hearts hammering against their ribs like frantic birds. Before them lay not the Europe they knew, but the vast, terrifying emptiness of central Texas. It was an ocean of land, an expanse of open plains devoid of the familiar comforts of forests or mountains. It was just mile upon mile of raw, unbroken earth lying in an intimidating, profound silence. Otto, his face pale, pointed a trembling finger towards the eastern horizon, where a faint band of gold was beginning to bleed into the indigo sky. "That way," he whispered, his voice thick with hope and fear. "South," Keller replied with a resolve he didn't entirely feel. "To Mexico." And so they began to walk. Their steps were unsteady, their bodies weakened by captivity, but a strange, giddy lightness filled their hearts. For the first time in years, there were no barked orders, no stiff uniforms adorned with swastikas, no ideology pressing down upon them. There was only the wind whispering secrets through the grass and the immense, liberating space. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, they had navigated a dry, rocky creek bed and found a pair of deep-rutted wagon tracks that passed for a road, leading toward a distant, dark line of trees. Their plan was straightforward, born of desperation rather than wisdom. Follow the tracks, reach the mighty Rio Grande, procure a boat by any means necessary, and disappear into the anonymity of Mexico. In their minds, America was a nation of dense industrial cities, bustling ports, and mustered soldiers. They were utterly unprepared for this, a landscape that seemed to absorb sound, light, and hope with equal indifference. By mid-morning, their initial euphoria had evaporated under the brutal, unforgiving Texas sun. The stolen canteen was now dangerously light, and the land revealed its true nature, an endless, shimmering panorama of heat and thirst. They passed a sun-bleached, splintered wooden sign that read, "Private ranch property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Keller allowed himself a cynical smirk. "Perfect," he muttered to Otto. "Perhaps we can appropriate some horses." The thought was a testament to his European mindset. He could not yet comprehend that the men who owned these horses possessed skills far beyond soldiering. They could read a broken blade of grass, a displaced stone, or a single footprint with the same clarity with which a hunter follows a trail of blood. Back at Camp Hearn, the tranquility was shattered at 9:07 a.m. when a sharp-eyed guard noticed the telltale sag in the fence line. Within minutes, the camp was a hive of frantic activity. Jeeps roared to life, their engines snarling, while military policemen barked orders into crackling radios. The camp commander urgently contacted the local sheriff's office in Bryan County, relaying the news. 2 German prisoners of war, potentially armed and dangerous, had escaped under cover of darkness and were presumed to be heading south. Sheriff Tom Landry, a man whose calm demeanor was as much a part of him as his well-worn Stetson, listened to the report with a quiet intensity, quietly chewing on a toothpick. "I'll put the word out," he said, his voice a slow, steady drawl before hanging up the receiver. He then turned to a small group of ranchers who had been sipping coffee nearby, their faces etched with the patience of men who live by the rhythms of the land. "Well, boys," Landry announced, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Looks like we got ourselves a little chase." The men responded with low, confident chuckles as they reached for their hats and moved toward their saddles. "Is the army coming too?" one of them asked. Landry shook his head. "Don't need the army for this. This is our land. They won't get far." By noon, the cowboys were mounted and riding. 6 men, all locals, armed not with malice but with rifles, full canteens, and a lifetime of experience in reading the subtle language of the terrain, a skill no soldier, however well trained, could ever claim to master. Out in the sprawling wilderness, the sun beat down mercilessly on the 2 German fugitives as they stumbled through tall, scratchy grass. Keller, for all his military training, did not notice the fresh horse tracks imprinted in a patch of soft earth. He did not understand the significance of a faint, carrying whistle on the wind, a signal between the ranchers. He was only aware of the land itself, which seemed to be closing in around him, its endlessness becoming a prison of exposure. By sunset, the pursuing ranchers discovered their first concrete clue, a clear boot print, its sole pattern distinctive, pressed into the mud beside a small, stagnant pond. Next to it lay a discarded mess tin, unmistakably stamped with Hearn Camp. The oldest among them, a man with leathery skin and eyes that missed nothing, knelt and touched the edge of the print with 2 calloused fingers, gauging its depth and freshness. "Heading southwest," he declared with quiet authority. "And they're tired, slowing down." He stood, his gaze sweeping across the vast, orange-hued horizon. "They don't know it yet," he added, his voice laced with a strange blend of pity and certainty. "But in a way, their journey is already over. They're home, whether they like it or not." The scene faded into the deepening dusk, the long, spectral shadows of the riders stretching across the plains. The sound of hoofbeats, steady and relentless, seemed to merge with the very wind itself. A narrator's voice closed the opening sequence with a line that encapsulated the film's central theme. In war, they had managed to escape the battlefield. But here in Texas, they were about to learn the true, humbling meaning of freedom. Act 1 of The Illusion of Freedom. 2 weeks prior to the escape, the atmosphere within Camp Hearn was one of surreal, almost peaceful routine. The constant Texas wind carried the scents of pine and dry dust through the open barracks windows. Groups of prisoners gathered around chessboards meticulously carved from scrap wood, their laughter a soft, incongruous sound beneath the ever-present guard towers. Corporal Ernst Keller sat apart at a rough-hewn table, his posture ramrod straight, his hands moving with precise, deliberate movements, as he traced a crude, imagined map of their escape route onto a torn piece of paper. Across from him, Otto Fuchs watched with nervous energy, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm. "Mexico," Keller stated, his finger drawing a decisive, jagged line southward. "Once we cross the Rio Grande, we are free men." Otto frowned, his brow furrowed with doubt. "And you believe the Americans will simply allow us to walk across? You think it will be that straightforward?" Keller's smirk was a thin, confident line. "It is a better fate than rotting in this place like livestock. We are soldiers, Otto, not common criminals. It is our duty to attempt escape." Around them, other prisoners pretended not to eavesdrop. Some considered Keller a reckless fool, a dreamer whose ambitions would get them all into trouble. Others, however, watched him with a secret, burning admiration, seeing in him a flicker of the defiance and pride that the war had slowly extinguished. In the hushed evenings, Keller would gather small, trusted groups, whispering intricate plans, trading favors and rations for contraband tools. A file pilfered from the mechanic's workshop, a pair of wire cutters smuggled from the kitchen. His greatest coup was a carelessly left fence inspection report, which he studied until he had committed every weakness, every guard rotation schedule, to memory. For Keller, this escape was more than a bid for liberty. It was a matter of restoring shattered pride, a demonstration that a German officer could still outthink his captors. He confided in his secret diary that night, his script sharp and angular. "The Americans are soft. Their comfort has made them complacent. They place too much trust in their fences and their routines. They cannot comprehend what a man, hardened by true hunger and the constant specter of fear, is capable of achieving." His assessment, however, was a profound miscalculation of both the American character and the very nature of strength. The camp itself was a study in contradictions. It was a place defined by barbed wire and watchtowers, yet within its confines, the prisoners had been allowed to cultivate small, vibrant vegetable gardens. The American guards were firm and vigilant, but they were not cruel. Every Sunday, a local chaplain would visit, offering words of solace and even shaking hands through the fence. There were educational classes, occasional musical performances, and a small, well-used library. It was not the brutal, vengeful captivity Keller had been conditioned to expect. It was something far more disorienting, a calm, almost indifferent detention. It was a semblance of freedom inside a cage, and in some ways, that was more psychologically taxing than outright brutality. That final night, under the dim yellow glow of the barracks' single electric bulb, Keller and Otto went over their plan one last time. They would slip out in the pre-dawn darkness, crawl beneath the weakened section of the eastern perimeter fence, and use the natural cover of cattle trails to navigate toward what they believed was the nearest river, which would then guide them to the border. As they sealed their pact with a firm handshake, Otto could not contain his apprehension. "Ernst, do you truly believe we can succeed?" Keller's gaze drifted towards the small, barred window, through which a sliver of the immense, starry Texas sky was visible. "We survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, Otto. How much worse can a stretch of Texas prairie be?" Outside, the lonesome, repetitive call of a whip-poor-will echoed across the landscape, a haunting sound that seemed to be the very voice of this unknown land. From his bunk nearby, an older, weary prisoner, Sergeant Weber, muttered softly into his pillow, his words heavy with experience. "You can escape the fences, boys, but mark my words, you cannot escape America itself." Neither Keller nor Otto acknowledged him. They could not yet know that Weber's warning was prophetic, that beyond the wire awaited not a hunter's bullet, but something far more disarming and transformative, simple, unadorned human kindness. The scene faded to black as Keller carefully concealed his diary beneath a loose floorboard. The ever-present low hum of the camp's generator returned to the soundtrack, a steady, patient, and utterly unbothered sound, as if the land itself was waiting. And the next morning, before the first hint of light, the fence would yield for the first time. Act 2, the land as adversary and teacher. By noon on their first day of freedom, the sun was no longer a source of light and warmth. It had become a personal, vindictive adversary. Keller pulled the coarse collar of his worn uniform tight around his sweating neck, a futile gesture against the oppressive heat. The air above the grasslands shimmered and danced in a heat haze, creating cruel mirages of water and shade. Every horizon was a perfect, unbroken line of flat, golden grass, beautiful in its way, but crushingly empty and uniform. Otto stumbled along beside him, his face beaded with sweat that traced clean lines through the dust on his skin. Their stolen canteen was already half empty, a fact they both noted with a growing sense of dread. The small, hard loaves of bread they had taken from the mess hall had crumbled into dry, tasteless dust in the relentless heat. "You said there would be trees," Otto mumbled, his voice raspy. "You said there would be shade." "There will be," Keller insisted, though the certainty in his own voice was eroding with every barren mile. The road they followed was not a proper road at all, but merely two parallel ruts carved by wagon wheels, cutting a seemingly arbitrary path through the endless prairie. There were no vehicles, no farmhouses, no signs of civilization. Only those endless, thin strands of barbed wire, demarcating ranches of a scale that defied their European comprehension. Initially, Keller had perceived this vast openness as the very essence of the freedom they sought. No walls, no guards, no barking sergeants, just limitless space. But as the hours wore on, that very space began to feel suffocating. This was not the freedom of opportunity. It was the freedom of exposure, of utter vulnerability. He looked down and saw his once sturdy boots splitting at the seams, the fine red dust of Texas pouring in with every step, chafing his feet raw. His uniform, once a symbol of pride and order, now clung to him like a damp, filthy shroud. They passed a dry, rocky creek bed littered with the sun-bleached bones of cattle. Otto stopped, staring at the skeletal remains with a hollow look in his eyes. "Are we even still in Texas?" he asked, the question meant as a weak joke, but carrying an edge of genuine despair. Keller did not answer. He was beginning to understand a fundamental truth. In Texas, the landscape presented an illusion of liberty, but to actually traverse it, to survive within it, required a specific kind of knowledge and resilience they sorely lacked. By late afternoon, their thirst had become a raging fire in their throats. They spotted a lone, creaking windmill standing sentinel over an empty field. Beneath it sat a rusted cylindrical water tank, its metal groaning softly as it shifted in the wind. Keller, with a surge of desperate hope, climbed the rickety ladder and peered inside. The water was brown, swarming with algae and insects, but to their parched eyes it was a divine nectar. They drank greedily, gulping down the metallic, muddy-tasting liquid, not caring about the consequences. "Do you think anyone saw us?" Otto asked nervously, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Keller scanned the horizon. The plains were silent and still. No soldiers, no trucks, no pursuing cavalry. Just the incessant, droning hum of cicadas and the sighing of the wind. "No one is watching us," he stated, clinging to the illusion of their anonymity. But he was wrong. A mile away, his form distorted by the shimmering heat haze, a rancher sat perfectly still atop his horse at the edge of his property, a pair of binoculars held to his eyes. He had spotted the two distant, stumbling figures hours earlier, moving in a place where no one had any right to be. He hadn't reached for his radio to call the authorities. Not yet. He simply watched, his expression a mixture of curiosity and pity, waiting to see what the land would do to them first. Poor dumb fools, he murmured to his horse. They have no earthly idea what kind of country they've wandered into. As dusk began to paint the sky in shades of purple and orange, Keller and Otto collapsed in utter exhaustion beside another anonymous fence line, too weary to even speak. They had covered perhaps 10 miles, a paltry distance on the map, yet to their battered bodies and spirits, it felt as if they had crossed a continent. Keller lay on his back, looking up at the stars as they emerged one by one in the vast black velvet of the sky. There were no city lights, no sounds of artillery, just an immense, profound silence. And for the first time since crawling beneath that fence, he felt something unexpected and unsettling. It wasn't freedom. It was a profound, crushing sense of his own insignificance. He whispered the thought into the night air. So much land, so few people. How do they possibly control it all? How do they even know what happens out here? Otto didn't answer. He was already asleep, his head resting on his meager pack, his breathing shallow. In the distance, the coyotes' howl echoed once more, a primal sound that seemed to underscore their vulnerability. And somewhere, beyond the next line of low, rolling hills, the first group of riders was already preparing their saddles for the dawn. Act through, the pursuit, not of enemies, but of men. By the next dawn, the Texas plains were stirring with a life the Germans could not perceive. The ranchers had gathered at the local sheriff's outpost before the sun had even breached the horizon. 6 men, their faces weathered and lined by decades of sun and wind, their eyes holding the deep, patient knowledge of those who can read a story in a bent blade of grass or a disturbed stone. Sheriff Tom Landry leaned against the fender of his dusty pickup truck, a folded telegram from Camp Hearn in his hand. 2 German prisoners escaped before dawn, possibly armed, last seen heading southwest. He summarized, his voice calm as ever. He chewed thoughtfully on the end of a wooden matchstick. They won't last the weekend out there on their own. A younger cowboy, Will Turner, with a face still open and eager, laughed. "What makes you so sure, Sheriff? We heard these Germans marched halfway across Europe. They're tough." Landry glanced toward the endless horizon, his gaze knowing. "Europe, son. Don't have mesquite thorns that'll tear your clothes to ribbons, or rattlesnakes hiding under every other rock. And Europe's thirst ain't nothing like a Texas thirst." A low chuckle rippled through the group of men as they swung up into their saddles, their rifles resting in scabbards with a casual familiarity. There was no anger in their demeanor, no bloodlust. For them, this was not an extension of the war. It was a matter of local responsibility. Someone was lost on their land, and it was their duty, their code, to find them and bring them in. As they rode out, the sun rose at their backs, painting the fields in brilliant, blinding gold. The sound of their horses' hooves striking the hard, dry earth was a steady, rhythmic percussion. Each man carried the essentials, a full canteen, a coiled lariat, and a quiet, unshakable pride that needed no external validation. Out here, they didn't operate on military rank or government orders. They followed something older and more deeply ingrained, the cowboy's code. A man's word was his bond. A stranger, even an enemy, deserved fairness and a chance until he proved himself unworthy. And no one, not even a fugitive, was to be left to die in the merciless expanse of the desert. Will rode alongside Landry, his eyes constantly scanning the vast landscape. "Sheriff, what will you actually do when we catch up to them?" Landry shrugged, a simple, effortless motion. "Give 'em water, most likely. Maybe some jerky if they look hungry. Then we'll call the army and let them handle the official part." Will looked surprised. That's it? No guns? No. Showdown. A faint smile touched Landry's lips. Son, a real cowboy never feels the need to prove how tough he is. The land itself does that for you, every single day. It knows who's strong and who ain't. We don't need to advertise it. By noon, they discovered their first solid clue. A small shred of grey uniform cloth, snagged on a barb of the wire fence, still damp with the sweat of the man who had brushed against it. Landry dismounted and crouched, his fingers gently brushing over the crushed grass beside the fence post. They're still heading southwest, he confirmed. But they'll start to curve soon. They all do. Why's that? Will asked. Because out here, the sheriff said, rising to his full height and dusting off his hands. A man can see what he thinks is freedom for 50 miles in every direction. But after a while, he starts to realize he's just a tiny speck walking in a very, very large circle. The land plays tricks on your mind. It guides you without you ever knowing it. A few miles ahead, Keller and Otto stumbled onward, completely unaware that the gap between them and their pursuers was closing rapidly. Otto's lips were now cracked and bleeding, his steps becoming a pained shuffle. Keller fought to maintain his military composure, but his own pride was being steadily eroded by the sheer physical dominance of the environment. When they spotted another distant windmill, Keller felt a faint flicker of hope. Water, he croaked. But before they could take another step toward it, a sound they had been dreading drifted to them on the wind. The sound of horses, not a frantic gallop, but a steady, confident, rhythmic walking. Otto froze, his eyes wide with terror. Ernst, do you hear that? Keller nodded slowly, his body tense. Soldiers. The sound grew clearer, more distinct. It was the sound of purposeful, unhurried movement. No, Keller said, a strange realization dawning on him. Not soldiers. As they turned, a plume of dust became visible on the horizon. Then, emerging from the shimmering heat, came the silhouettes of 6 horsemen. They were framed against the burning blue of the sky, their shapes iconic and formidable. The 2 Germans did not yet understand that the men riding toward them were not coming for vengeance or for glory. They were coming to impart a lesson that the battlefield was incapable of teaching, the profound power of mercy in a land so vast that it had no room for petty hatred. Act 4. The capture, an unlikely hospitality. By late afternoon, the heat was once again a palpable force. Keller's vision swam with fatigue and dehydration. His uniform was in tatters, his hands a mess of blisters and scratches from countless encounters with barbed wire and thorny mesquite bushes. Otto was in a worse state, his breathing a shallow rasp, his spirit clearly broken. Then, unmistakably, the sound of hooves returned. This time, it was not a distant echo, but a close, surrounding presence. Keller grabbed Otto's shoulder, his voice a desperate hiss. Down! Now! He pulled his comrade into a shallow, dusty ditch lined with sharp mesquite branches. They pressed themselves into the earth, their hearts pounding so loudly they were sure it would betray them. The rhythmic thudding of the horses came to a halt directly above them. A voice called out, not with aggression, but with a calm, almost conversational tone. You boys look a little lost. Keller froze. The English was clear, but softened by that distinct, slow Texan cadence. Otto whispered, his voice trembling. They've found us. Keller dared to peer over the lip of the ditch. 6 riders sat astride their horses, motionless, their forms creating dark silhouettes against the brilliant setting sun. They wore wide-brimmed hats, and their rifles remained slung, a picture of relaxed readiness. Sheriff Landry nudged his horse a single step forward. I'm guessing you 2 fellas are from Camp Hearn. Keller remained silent, his mind racing, trying to discern the trap in this calm. Landry let out a short, soft sigh. Ain't no use in hiding, son. We've been following your trail for the better part of 10 miles. I'll give you this. You made it farther than most. The utter lack of hostility was what unnerved Keller the most. There was no shouting, no brandishing of weapons, just a simple statement of fact. Finally, with a slow, deliberate movement, Keller rose to his feet, his hands held slightly away from his body in a universal gesture of surrender. Otto shakily followed suit. "Don't shoot," Keller said, his English broken but understandable. "Shoot?" Landry actually chuckled. "Heck, boy, we didn't even bring enough bullets for the coyotes that'd been after my chickens." The cowboys dismounted with a smooth, practiced ease. One of them, a man with a kind face, walked directly toward Keller and offered him a dented Army-issue canteen. "Here," the man said. "Water first. Questions can wait till later." Keller stared at the proffered canteen as if it were a venomous snake. Then, his thirst overpowering his suspicion, he took it and drank. The water was warm, but it felt like life itself flowing down his parched throat. He drank in long, desperate gulps, then passed it to Otto, who did the same. Otto wiped his mouth, his eyes wide with confusion. Why are they helping us?" he whispered in German. Will Turner, the young cowboy, overheard the foreign tongue and grinned. "Because," he said cheerfully, "folks dying of thirst in our county is just plain bad for business." The group of men laughed softly at this. The sound was so disarming that even Keller, despite his fear and pride, felt the corners of his own mouth twitch into a faint, weary smile. They were helped onto 2 spare horses, their hands tied in front of them with a loose, almost ceremonial knot, more a formality than a genuine restraint. As the group began the ride back towards civilization, the conversation that ensued was surreal, dreamlike. "You boys are from Germany, huh?" Will asked, riding alongside them. "Yes," Keller replied quietly. "Guess that explains the accent. You ever ridden a horse before?" Keller shook his head. "No, never." "Well," Will said, his grin widening, "you're in for a real treat. Just try not to fall off. The sheriff here hates paperwork more than he hates rattlesnakes." Another wave of easy laughter moved through the group. For a few fleeting moments, the war, the uniforms, the ideologies, all of it faded into insignificance. They were just a group of men on horseback, moving through an immense landscape. When they reached a small, clear-running creek, Landry called for a halt. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out 2 long strips of dried beef jerky, handing one to each prisoner. Otto looked at the dark, leathery strip with suspicion. "What is this?" he asked. "Beef?" Landry said simply. "You're in Texas now, son. We tend to eat more cows than we shoot people with guns." Keller hesitated for only a second before biting into the jerky. It was tough, requiring serious effort to chew, and incredibly salty. To his starved palate, it was a feast. He looked up at the sheriff, still working the meat in his mouth. You treat your prisoners like they are guests?" he asked, the concept foreign to him. Landry gave a nonchalant shrug. "Your war's almost over. From what we hear on the radio, it's just a matter of time. Anyway, hating a man takes more energy than feeding him." For the first time since his capture, Ernst Keller did not feel like a soldier, nor did he feel like a captive. He felt simply like a man. He felt a sense of his own humanity being returned to him. As the group moved on, the setting sun casting long, dramatic shadows, Otto leaned close to Keller and whispered in German, "These men, they don't seem to hate us at all." Keller nodded slowly, a dawning comprehension in his eyes. "I know," he replied quietly. "And that is precisely what makes them so formidable. They are not defined by their enemies." Sheriff Landry, whose sharp ears missed little, overheard the remark. He nudged his horse a little closer and said, without looking at them, Son, hating someone is easy. It's the lazy man's way. Being decent, that actually takes a little work." His words hung in the warm evening air, carrying a weight and a wisdom that felt more powerful than any political slogan or military command. When they finally reached the outskirts of the small town, a handful of locals came out to watch the procession. They didn't shout curses or throw stones. They simply watched with curiosity. Children pointed at the two dusty Germans on horseback, and one old rancher, leaning against a post, called out to Landry with a chuckle, "Don't let 'em outwork you now, Tom." The crowd laughed, a warm, inclusive sound. Keller looked at their faces, relaxed, open, completely devoid of the fear and tension that had been the constant backdrop of life in Europe. And in that moment, he felt he finally understood the deep, hidden strength that had broken the back of the German war machine. It wasn't superior numbers or more advanced technology. It was this, an unshakable, inherent calm, a confidence born not from conquest, but from a profound sense of freedom and self-reliance. As the camera would pan upward, the small group would be seen riding directly into the blazing Texas sunset, the war receding behind them like a bad dream, and an uncertain, but strangely hopeful, future lying ahead. Act 5. The Aftermath, a lesson in the quietest strength. The morning after their capture, Keller awoke to a sensation so alien it took him a moment to identify it. The rich, savory, unforgettable smell of frying bacon. He lay perfectly still on the clean cot in the camp infirmary, his eyes tracing the patterns of morning sunlight on the wooden ceiling. For a beautiful, suspended moment, the world was at peace. Otto slept soundly in the next cot, his wounds cleaned and bandaged, his breathing deep and regular. Then the sound came again, the sizzle and pop from the camp kitchen. Real bacon. Outside the infirmary window, he could hear the low murmur of voices, the occasional burst of genuine laughter, and the soft notes of a harmonica playing a melancholic cowboy tune. It was a soundscape of peace, of a life unhurried and unafraid. Keller sat up. His own soiled uniform was gone, replaced by a clean, folded set of clothes on the chair beside his bed. Someone had even left a tin mug of coffee for him, still warm to the touch. He lifted it, inhaling the deep, rich aroma, so different from the bitter ersatz brew they were accustomed to. The door opened, and it was Sheriff Landry who entered, not a guard. He carried a simple metal plate. "You look like you've been dragged behind a wagon," the sheriff remarked, his tone dry but not unkind. "Figured we ought to do something about that." He set the plate down. It held a generous portion of scrambled eggs, several strips of crisp bacon, a thick slice of bread, and a small melting square of real butter. Keller stared, dumbfounded. "This is for me?" Landry raised an eyebrow. "You see anyone else in here who looks half-starved?" Keller almost laughed, a strange, choked sound. Otto stirred, waking up and blinking at the plate as if it were a hallucination. Landry poured them both more coffee and leaned against the doorframe. "You two gave us a good chase," he admitted. "Almost made me work up a sweat for a change." Otto offered a weak, grateful smile. "In Germany," he said slowly, searching for the English words, "this would be impossible." "What, breakfast?" Landry asked. "No," Keller answered, his voice soft with emotion. "Mercy." The sheriff's expression grew more serious, his eyes holding Keller's gaze. "Mercy's cheap," he said. "It don't cost a man much to be decent to another man." For a while, the only sounds in the room were the clinking of forks on tin plates and the quiet, satisfied sounds of men eating their first real meal in a long time. Keller ate slowly, savoring each flavor, each texture, as if committing it to memory. Otto kept looking around the room, at his clean hands, at the sheriff, as if trying to reconcile this reality with the one he had been prepared for. "We were told," Keller ventured quietly, "that if we were captured by Americans, we would be beaten, starved, humiliated." Landry gave another of his characteristic shrugs, a gesture that seemed to dismiss the very notion of such pettiness. "Hating takes time and effort," he said. "We've got fences to mend, cattle to brand, lives to live." He tipped his hat and left them to their meal. Keller watched him go, then turned his gaze back to the window. Outside, he saw the same cowboys who had tracked them across the plains. They were now unloading bales of hay from a wagon, working with a slow, efficient rhythm, joking and laughing with one another. There were no guards supervising them with weapons, no one barking orders. They were just men, engaged in the honest work of the land. Otto said softly, "They are treating us as though the war never even happened." Keller nodded. "Perhaps," he replied. "That is the very reason they are winning." Later, when they were escorted back to the main prisoner compound, the other Germans stared in disbelief. They had expected to see their comrades return bruised, broken, and defeated. Instead, Keller and Otto came back, sunburned, well-fed, and each carrying a half-finished cup of coffee. One of the prisoners whispered to Keller, "What happened? Did they capture you, or did they adopt you?" Keller allowed himself a genuine, if weary, smile. "I believe," he said, "it was a little of both." That night, under a sky brilliant with stars, Keller took out his hidden diary for the first time since his recapture. He wrote, "We escaped one war only to find ourselves disarmed by a civilization we were taught to despise. America's ultimate weapon is not its army or its industry. It is its profound, unassuming heart." He read the sentence over, then underlined it twice before closing the book. Outside, the harmonica began to play again, its tune slow and gentle, a lullaby for the weary. The fences of the camp stood outlined in the silvery moonlight, but for the first time, Keller did not see them as walls meant to confine him. They seemed more like a delicate boundary line drawn between two worlds. One, the old world of ideology and hate, which was collapsing under its own weight, and the other, this new world, which was quietly, patiently demonstrating to him what true, enduring strength looked like.